Hello astrology lovers. In this video I will talk on birth time rectification using marriage and childbirth dates using transit and progression. So let's quickly study the birth details. Birth date and day 16th August 1960 Tuesday. Birth time 2 a.m. rectified to 1 hours 58 minutes 15 seconds by me. Place of birth Chennai, Tamil Nadu, India. Time zone and name plus 5:30 Indian Standard Time. Latitude 13 degrees 5 north, longitude 80 degrees 18 east, geocentric latitude 12 degrees 59 55.43 north, nakshatra Rohini third quarter, Tithi Krishna Paksha Dasami, and Anmash Khullar hourly 23 degrees 17 45.44 After entering the details, software will provide us with planetary position table, Rashi chart, cuspal position table, and Bhav chart. Rising sign here is Gemini. Moon is positioned in 12th house in the sign of Taurus. So let's quickly begin with the steps of birth time rectification. The first step of birth time rectification is Lagna sub-sublord must link with moon, star, or vice versa directly or indirectly. Here in this case moon is in the star of moon. So any planet that's the sublord or sub-sublord of moon or the star of moon, that's moon, can be taken as the Lagna sub-sublord. Here Saturn happens to be the sublord of moon, so Saturn was taken as Lagna sub-sublord. Let's move to step number 2, that's co-rulers of Lagna, Sun, Moon's Rashi, Star, Sub and Sub-sublord. Star and Sublord must appear in 1, 7 and 10. Why 1, 7 and 10? Because when a child takes birth, a person becomes a father, and 9th cusp is connected to father, and a child birth happens when stimulation to cusps 2, 5 and 11 happens. 2 is connected to expansion of family, 5th is connected to childbirth, and 11th is connected to fulfillment of desire or fulfillment of ambition. And 2, 5, 11 from 9th is 1, 7 and 10, because 2 from 9th is 10th, 5th from 9th is 1, and 11th from 9th is 7th. So if stimulation to any two cusps out of 1, 7 and 10 will happen, then a childbirth will happen, provided transit supports. So in this table we have to study Sun, Moon and cusp 1. Sun because it's connected to father, Moon because it's connected to mother, and cusp 1 because it's connected to Lagna or the person. So let's study the 4 planets of Sun. When childbirth happened, Sun was in Moon's Rashi. So let's study Moon. Moon is in the star of Moon and sub is Saturn. Moon appears in 7th, Saturn appears in 1, 7 and 10th. Sun was in the star of Mercury, and Mercury in the star of Saturn, and sublord is Rahu. Saturn appears in 1, 7 and 10. Rahu appears in 10. Sun was in the sublord of Saturn. Saturn's star is Venus. Sublord is Rahu. Venus appears in 1. Rahu appears in 10th. Venus also appears in 10th. Sun was in the sub-sublord of Rahu. Rahu in the star of Venus and sublord in Saturn. Venus appears in 1 and 10. Saturn appears in 1, 7 and 10. Then Moon was in the Rashi of Venus, and Venus, star is Venus, sublord is also Venus, and sub-sublord is Jupiter. Whenever star and sub both are same, so we have to take the sub-sublord as the sublord. So here Venus is the star and Jupiter will become sub. and Venus appears in 1 and 10. Jupiter appears in 10 and 7th. Moon was in the star of Moon, and Moon we have studied because Sun was in the Rashi of Moon, so Moon we will not study again. Moon was in the sublord of Saturn. Saturn also we have studied because Sun was also in the sublord of Saturn. Then Jupiter. Moon was in the subsublord of Jupiter, and Jupiter's star is Ketu, sublord is also Ketu, and subsublord is Jupiter. So, like I told you earlier, when star and sub are same, then sublord will become sublord. So here Ketu is star and sublord is Jupiter. Ketu does not appear in 1, 7 and 10, but Ketu represents Saturn and Jupiter. Saturn appears in 1, 7 and 10, and Jupiter appears in 7th. So Ketu also appears in 1, 7 and 10, and Jupiter's sublord Jupiter appears in 7th. So all the three cusps getting stimulated, Jupiter appearing in 7 and 10. And then we have to study cusp 1's Rashi, star, sub and sub-sub, just like we studied Sun and Moon's Rashi, star, sub and sub-sub. So here, as the Lagna is Gemini, rising lord is the lord of Gemini is Mercury, and Mercury we have studied here because Sun was in the star of Mercury, so we will not study. Then star is Mars. Mars is Moon and Jupiter. Moon appears in 7th, Jupiter appears in 7th and 10th. Then sublord is Venus. Venus we have studied here, we will not study again. Then Saturn. Saturn we have already studied here. So all these planets stimulate any two cusps out of 1, 7 and 10, and that's the reason childbirth happened. You can study or get the information from this page. Here I have mentioned Moon, Mercury, Saturn and Rahu, the 4 planets of Sun, and how its star and sub-sub they stimulated the desired cusps for birth to happen. Similarly in the case of Moon also the same thing, and also for cusp 1 or Lagna, Lagna, it's Rashi, star, sub and sub-sub, they stimulated the required cusps for the birth to happen. So we are done with 2 steps of rectification. Let's move to the 3rd step of birth time rectification. That's the moment at which the event happens is controlled by the prana lord. So at the moment of birth, the prana lord Rahu should be significator of 10, 1, 7 houses. At least 2 out of these houses or prana lord Rahu itself should appear in these cusps, irrespective of the fact it has positional status or not. So Rahu must stimulate any 2 out of these 3 cusps, as Rahu was the prana lord when the birth happened. Rahu has positional status and Rahu represents Venus, and Rahu as it represents Venus, Venus appears in 1 and 10. So Rahu also appears in 1 and 10. Also Rahu star Venus appears in 1 and 10. Sublord Saturn appears in 1, 7 and 10, and subsublord Mercury appears in 1. So all the 3 cusps getting stimulated. Let's move to the 4th step of birth time rectification, that's arc. As Lagna is Gemini, a male sign, and person is a male, this arc was set to less than 50 degrees or less than 50%, that's 49.24. As you can see here, rising sign is Gemini and person happens to be a male. So arc should be less than 50, and here arc was set to less than 50, that's 49.24. Let's move to the 5th step of birth time rectification, that's arc of first descendant. 5th cusp is connected to first descendant, and 5th cusp has Libra, and Libra happens to be a male sign. and this step was this was ignored. The first child happens to be a female, so as it's Libra, and Libra happens to be a male sign, and the first descendant or first child happens to be a daughter, so arc should be more than 50, but this was ignored because here sub-sublord is Moon, and Moon is a female planet, and Moon happens to be in its own star, so the arc factor was ignored. And even if the arc is not more than 50, because sign is Libra and Libra is a male sign, we can still go ahead. Now the sixth step, that's family links, must get established. First daughter's moon star is Saturn, and second daughter's moon star is Jupiter. First child is connected to fifth cusp, and fifth cusp sub-sublord is Moon, and Moon sub-lord is Saturn, so it makes link with the first child, and second child is connected to seventh sub-sublord, and seventh sub-sublord is Saturn. Saturn must make link with Jupiter. Here Jupiter is in the star of Ketu, and if Jupiter is in the star of Ketu, it means that Jupiter is also in the star of the planets that Ketu represents, and Ketu represents Saturn. So Jupiter also happens to be in the star of Saturn, so Jupiter makes link with Saturn, so seventh sub-sublord Saturn makes link with Jupiter, so family links also gets established. Now moving to the seventh step of birth time rectification. In this step we will verify some events of this person's life, and this person got married on 24th May 1987 in Chennai around 10 a.m. So the dasha on 24th May 1987, Moon was Bhukti Lord and Antar Lord, Sun was Sukshma, and Mercury was Prana. And we have to study cusp 7, 5, 11 because these three cusps are connected to marriage. So let's begin our study. We have to study the dasha, and like I told you, we have to focus on these three planets, Sun, Moon and Mercury, because these planets appeared in dasha. So we begin with Sun, star is Mercury, sublord is Saturn. Mercury in 5th and Saturn in 7th. Then Moon, Moon star is Moon and sublord is Saturn. Moon in 5th, Saturn in 7th. And Mercury, star is Saturn, sub is Rahu. Saturn in 7th, and Rahu represents Venus. And Venus appears in 5th and 11th. So 5, 7 and 11, all the three cusps getting stimulated. If stimulation happens to any two out of these three cusps, then event happens provided transit supports. So let's also study the transit for 24th May 1987 to check if transit on that very day supported marriage or not. On that very day, this is the transit for all the planets. We have to focus on Jupiter, Sun and Moon, because Jupiter is connected to year of event, Sun is connected to month of event, and Moon is connected to day of event. So let's begin with Jupiter. Jupiter was in the Rashi of Jupiter. Now let's study Jupiter. Jupiter happens to be in the star of Ketu, and sub-sublord is Jupiter. As Ketu happens to be star and sub, we will combine this and study Ketu and Jupiter. Ketu appears in 11th, and Ketu appears in 11th and 7th, and Jupiter appears in 7th. So 11 and 7 getting stimulated. Similarly, Jupiter in the star of Mercury, Mercury in the star of Saturn, and sublord is Rahu. Sorry, Jupiter in the star of Mercury, Mercury in the star of Saturn, and sublord is Rahu. Rahu represents Venus, and Venus appears in 11th and 5th. So Rahu also appears in 11th and 5th, and Saturn, the star, appears in 7th. So all the three cusps getting stimulated. Then Jupiter in the sublord of Rahu. Rahu star is Venus and sublord is Saturn. Venus in 11th and 5th, and Saturn in 7th. Then Jupiter in the subsublord of Venus. Venus star is Venus, sublord is also Venus. So this will get combined, and Jupiter we have to study as the sublord. So Venus appears in 11th and 5th. Jupiter appears in 7th. Then we have to study Sun, just like we studied Jupiter, because Sun is connected to month of event. Sun was in the Rashi of Venus, and Venus we have studied here, so we will not repeat. Then Sun was in the star of Sun. So Sun is Mercury and Saturn. Mercury in 5th and Saturn in 7th. And then Sun in the sublord of Venus. Venus we have already studied. Subsublord Rahu we have studied here, so we will not study again. Moon in the Rashi of Jupiter. Jupiter we have studied here. Moon in the star of Mercury. Mercury we have studied here. Moon in the sublord of Saturn. Saturn is Venus and Rahu. Venus is in 5th and 11th, and Rahu represents Sun and Venus. So Venus appears in 5th and 11th, so Rahu will also appear in 5th and 11th. So 5 and 11 getting stimulated. Similarly, Moon in the subsublord of Mercury, and Mercury as we have studied here, we will not study it again. So we can see how Jupiter, Sun and Moon appeared in the desired planets to support marriage to happen. Now let's move to another event. On 28th February 1988, he became father for the first time. Birth of first daughter, and Dasha on that very day was Moon, Mercury, Mars. We have to focus on Bhukti, Antar, Sukshma and Prana. So Moon, Mercury, Mars. So let's study the Dasha. Let's study these three planets. So Moon, Mars and Mercury. We have to focus on cusps 2, 5 and 11, because first child is connected to 2, 5 and 11. So Moon in the star of Moon, and sublord is Saturn. Here Moon appears in 2 and 5. Saturn appears in 2. So 2 and 5 getting stimulated. Similarly Mars in the star of Moon, and sublord is Jupiter. Moon appearing in 2 and 5, and Jupiter appearing in 2. And then Mercury in the star of Saturn, and sublord is Rahu. Saturn appearing in 2. Rahu represents Venus, and Venus appearing in 5th and 11th. So the desired cusp got stimulated and childbirth happened. Now let's also study transit, because an event happens only when transit supports. And we have to study Jupiter, Sun and Mercury, just like we studied earlier. Jupiter was in the Rashi of Mars when birth happened. So Mars in the star of Moon, and sub is Jupiter. Moon in Moon and Jupiter both in 2. Then Moon in 5th. So 2 and 5 getting stimulated. Similarly, Jupiter in the in the star of Ketu. Ketu in star of Jupiter, and sublord is Saturn. So Jupiter in 2, and Saturn in also in 2. And Jupiter appearing in 2, and Saturn also in 2. Ketu has positional status. So and Ketu appears in 11th. So 11th involvement and commitment with 11 with second. So 2 and 11 getting stimulated. Then moving to sublord Moon. Moon is in the star of Moon and sublord is Saturn. Moon appears in 2, 5 and Saturn appears in 2. Then Mercury. Mercury in Saturn star and Rahu sub. Saturn in 2, Rahu represents Venus and Venus appears in 5th and 11th. So Saturn in 2, Rahu in 5 and 11. Then Sun was in the Rashi of Saturn. Saturn star is Venus and sub is Rahu. So Venus in 5 and 11 and Rahu, as it represents Venus, Rahu also appears in 5 and 11. Then Rahu, Sun was in the star of Rahu and Rahu is Venus and Saturn. Venus here in 11 and Saturn in 2. Then Sun was in the sublord of Venus. Venus is Venus, Jupiter, and here we will club Venus. Star and sub will get clubbed. So Venus is star and Jupiter is sub. Venus appears in 5 and 11 and Jupiter appears in 2. Sub-sublord on that very day, sub-sublord was also Venus, and Venus we have just studied. Similarly Moon was in the Rashi of Mercury and Mercury we have studied here. Then Moon was in the star of Jupiter. Jupiter is Ketu, Jupiter. So Ketu will club. Ketu appears in 11th and Jupiter appears in 2. Then Moon was in the sublord of Moon. Moon we have studied here, and sub-sublord also Moon. So Moon we are done with studying. So we are done with the transit, and we understood how these planets were positioned in the right star, right Rashi, star, sub and sub-sub to support the event to happen. Let's also study progression. At times event does not happen despite dasha and transit supporting it, and if it does not appear in progression, then the event does not happen. So let's also study progression for the dasha planets. So just like a horoscope progresses, just like a person grows, similarly a horoscope also progresses. So this is the progression chart for 28th February 1998, and on that very day we have to study these three planets, because these three planets were dasha planets. So Moon is Rahu and Moon. Rahu represents Venus and Mars, and Mars appears in 11 and Venus appears in 2. So Rahu appears in 2 and 11 and Moon appears in 5th. So 2, 5 and 11. Similarly Mars also in the star of Rahu, and we just studied that Rahu appears in 2 and 11 and sublord Sun appears in 11. So 2 and 11 getting stimulated. Then Mercury in Venus, Moon. Venus will club, star and sub will get clubbed, and then sublord Moon. So Venus appears in 5th and Moon appears in 2 and 5. So progression chart also supports the event. Now let's study the second daughter's birth event that happened on 27th November 1989, Chennai. Dasha was Jupiter, Mercury. So here we will study Jupiter and Mercury. Let's begin with Jupiter. That's Ketu, Jupiter. So Ketu will club, star and sub will get clubbed, and Jupiter. So Ketu and Jupiter. Ketu appears in 11 and 7th, and Jupiter appears in 2 and 7. All the three cusps getting stimulated. Similarly Mercury in Saturn and Rahu. Saturn appears in 2 and Rahu represents Venus, and Venus appears in 11. So 2 and 11 getting stimulated. And let's also study transit, because without support of transit, event does not happen. On that very day, transit of Jupiter was in the Rashi of Mercury. So let's study Mercury in the star of Saturn, and sublord is Rahu. Saturn in 2, Rahu represents Venus in 11th. So 2 and 11. Similarly, Jupiter was in the star of Rahu, Venus and Saturn. Venus in 2, Saturn in 11. Venus in 11th and Saturn in 2. Jupiter was in the sublord of Venus. Venus has positional status, it's in the star and sub, so it will get clubbed. And so we have to study the position of Venus and Jupiter. Venus in 11th and Jupiter in 7th and 2. And then Jupiter was in the sublord of Moon. So Moon in star of Moon and sublord Saturn. Moon appears in 2 and Saturn also appears in 2. Then Moon and these two planets appear in 7th also. 2 and 7 all 2 and 7 getting stimulated. Then let's study Moon. Moon was in the Rashi of Mars. Mars is Moon and Jupiter. So Moon here and Jupiter also in 2. Then Jupiter and Moon both in 7. So 2 and 7. Then Moon was in the star of Jupiter. Jupiter is Ketu, Jupiter. And Ketu in 11th, Jupiter in 2 and 7, and Ketu also in 7. So 7, Ketu appears in 11 and 7, Jupiter appears in 2 and 7. Moon in the sublord of Moon, and Moon we have studied here, we will not study it again. Then Moon in the sublord of Ketu. Ketu is Jupiter, Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn both in 2. Then Jupiter appears and Saturn both in 7 also. So 2 and 7 getting stimulated. Then we have to study Jupiter. Jupiter we have already studied, because here we studied Jupiter. Moon also we have studied. Here we studied Moon. Mars also we have studied. So all the planets we have studied. We are done with the study of all the planets of transit, and now let's study the progression, because progression chart is essential to know if the event will happen or not. We have to study the two planets, that's Mercury and Jupiter, because these two planets were in Dasha. So Mercury is Venus, Mercury, and Venus appears in 7, Mercury appears in 2, so 7 and 2. Similarly, Jupiter, his star is Sun and so is Jupiter. Sun appears in 2 and Jupiter appears in 7. Sun appears in 7. Sun appears in 7 and 11, and Jupiter appears in 11th. So progression chart also supports the event. So in this video I spoke on how planets cause marriage, birth of children, and explained Dasha transit progression. So I rectified the horoscope using 3 events. I appreciate you took time to watch this video, and if you have any questions or queries, then please feel free to connect with me with the information mentioned in the description box. Also, if you found this video useful, then please give a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel, as in the next video I will talk on some more events connected to this person's life. These are the books that I referred to make this video. So I wish you have a wonderful day and stay safe.